I think I missed a week. A whole week. I I just noticed how long it's been since I was able to get on here. So I've had a few extra days called into work. I've had a few extra hours on some of the days I was working, and a few days of being sick, and a few days of doing a few other things. So I did some gaming with some friends, and I visited family again. So I feel a little bad that I wasn't. That's candy. Um, I hope it's candy. Geez, I'm up. Anyway, I didn't get the chance to shoot video, and I feel bad about that. But I'm trying not to hold myself to a video every night this year. We'll see where that ends up. But I think where we left it off last time was in the discussing of my world building project for some gaming. The idea of getting a sort of world structure that involves a divine realm and then the more earthly realms that they can travel to. And one of the things in that design that I do want to get to, and I guess I'll start here, is magic. Now, when looking at things like D&D or other tabletop role-playing games, there's usually two types of magic that they usually start from, and then classes of magic users that they have in game. So the two types are usually divine magic and arcane magic. So priestly and wizardly is what you end up with most often in any setting. Now, I don't always feel that makes sense to split them up like that. I mean, it feels to me like in story structure, oftentimes I've used a sort of a mental shorthand for myself, at least as the writer, to explain the systems of magic to be the same thing. The ones who are getting it from a divinity of some kind, whether you fabricate it as a divinity with archangels and angels and saints, and each you could make a prayer to a saint and they would help grant you miracles in a certain direction. That to me is one of the ways of doing that. You could also do the Greco-Roman gods pantheons, where you have you seek the blessings of a given divinity and they grant that to you, and that is how you get your blessings or whatever you're using. Arcane magic is usually meant to be more of people tapping directly into the forces of magic in the universe, using it like a scientist uses chemistry. You have recipes, you have procedures to follow that will tap into the forces of magic and produce a given result. Now, in most game terms, they're treated mechanically almost indistinct from one another. The faith-based magics usually tend to be ones that the priest just wakes up the cleric, the priest, the monk, however you want to manage it, the friar, they wake up on a given day with a new set of abilities granted to them over the night, or not a new set necessarily, but a set of abilities granted to them as they rested, and they will have those abilities until they use them, and then they're gone, and then the next day they will have those abilities again. Arcane magic is treated along the lines of they study their spell book, they capture within their brain a certain set of spells by studying their book during the course of the day, and then rest, and by the next day those spells are embedded in their brain. Or the narrative of how that's usually done isn't usually detailed very much. Maybe it's they wake up and during breakfast that morning they read their book and they learn the spells they're going to have for that day. That system is usually referred to as Vancian magic in fiction. I believe it's based on an author who wrote the Dying Earth series of books. And I'm going to be honest, most of my adult life in which I've played, read fantasy books, played games, and role-played some games, created games, I have had absolute dislike of Vancian magic. I do not like that as a system of magic. And I can give you, like, one of the biggest reasons it bothers me is with Vancian magic, a wizard can study a certain number of spells, retain them in spell slots in their brain, and then cast those spells during the course of the day. They've memorized those spells, they've cast them. You cannot cast those spells again that day. So this narratively, the way they usually do this is you've used those spells up and you can't use them again that day. You have to rest and replenish those spells in your brain to use them again. Narratively speaking, there is no excuse for the idea that a wizard cannot, while hiking along a road between two cities, study their book while they walk, or ride on a wagon and study their book and get those same spells on that same day and not be able to cast those spells again. But even beyond that, that plot hole is the issue I have with the very idea that a wizard who studies the forces of magic and has learned about it for years and has learned a certain set of spells that they have copied down into their book and uses them daily in many cases. If you use these things on a regular basis, you're going to tell me that you use it and then 10 minutes later you can't use that spell again? That's a plot hole. It's faulty. Now, there is something to be said for exploring the idea of excuse me, a game mechanic that uses Vancian magic in a more narratively interesting way. And I mean, having played with designing systems like this, I can see maybe exploring that at another time. But for me, Vancian magic is not the way I want to go. Now, in role-playing terms, what this amounts to is, making spells one-use items. You're making a currency, an economy of magic. You don't want somebody to get the wish spell and then be able to spam it. You don't want them to be able to cast it every 10 minutes. And I get that. I get that mechanic-wise, that's the way it works in a game. But there's an interesting thing about you don't have as big a problem with that being an issue in something like a computer game. Now, one of the tricks of designing a magic system that you can use in a computer game is very easily detailed. If you take a look at, I was looking up Morrowind magic and looking at the system for deciding the effects of a spell. And there are these big, long equations of like your score on this thing times 2 divided by this number plus this with these 4 modifiers, and then it's this big long string. And like, that's great for a computer game. If the computer can predictably use that system to predict how to portion out a resource like magic in a way that doesn't make it possible for you to solve all of your problems. That's cool for computer games. It's never going to fly on a tabletop game. You could potentially, in writing a story, use that kind of concept of knowing that about your character, using those mechanics in your world knowledge up here, and when it comes into a section of the story, you use that to figure out what would happen in that story. It's a little tedious as a writer to have to stop and do math equations to figure out if it's practical for that to happen during game or during the story. But you could do that. But tabletop game, when you're playing a game like that, you want a cleaner, simpler system. And, you know, part of that, in my way of thinking, is if you have something in your system that makes the character way overpowered, if they have the ability to use it all the time, then don't give them the ability to use it all the time. And their solution is one where they take it as don't use it all the time. Whereas for me, a wish spell is just something somebody should never get as a spell. That is something that is embedded in an object at a certain point. It's a complicated thing. Maybe it took a wizard his entire life to gather enough magic to punch a hole into the fabric of the universe to hack into the ability to grant wishes. That's not a spell. That is an assembly of abilities that took way longer to achieve. So if you're going to kind of limit things, you have the ability to fabricate this entire universe that you're building for your story, game, or whatever in a way that logistically makes sense. And so I've been dabbling with trying to figure out the best way to approach magics. And I've come across a couple different things I want to talk about. And I think I'll probably start this one with talking about divine-based magic and move into arcane-based stuff. But it gets a little tricky with some of this. For starters, if you're writing a story, you can write it any which way you want. In fiction, the distinction between a magic user, a wizard, a sorcerer, a warlock, these are all different terms for people who wield magic, and they don't really make a big distinction between there. A witch, a shaman, they all are really within the same realm. In computer games, there is a sort of a shorthand we've gotten used to, but it's still looser than tabletop games. So we're used to thinking of a magic user and a cleric or a healer, and we still kind of abide by some of that rule. In Dungeons and Dragons or other tabletop role-playing games, they've sort of parceled out this stuff to a lot of different things. So most of what I've looked at is early editions of Dungeons and Dragons. There's some Pathfinder stuff and a few other fantasy-based, because that's where you're more likely to encounter this. But in those systems, we have, I mean, at this point in 5th edition D&D, you're looking at just about everybody has magic-like abilities. But the generally considered magic user classes are going to be your, wow, it's tricky. They're sort of like magic users, and then there's like cousins of magic users. So we still have the cleric, the religious caster. We have the druid, the nature caster. We have the it's so tricky. The wizard, warlock, and sorcerer. And then you have these sort of like cousins of the bard has some musical based or flourish based magics. The ranger has some magics. I don't know why that would be the case. You have the monk who has key points, which is very similar to magic. You have the paladin who is essentially a cross between a sword wielding knight in armor and a cleric. And then you get even further into the weeds with class subclasses that can borrow traits from magic user classes. So thieves can get the arcane trickster. I think there's a couple of those, like a shadow thief or something, like an assassin or something. And then like the barbarians have a magical barbarian. The fighters have a eldritch knight. Like they've compounded and extended the reach of where magic goes. And admittedly, when I was building my universe for my game, tabletop game, video gaming, and storytelling in, I want there to be less prevalence of magic. I don't want like everybody and their dog to have it. And I don't want it to be able to do everything. But there's also an aspect of the fact that I'm going to be dealing with, at least for part of the story, divine realms and divine beings who all have access to magics and abilities. So how do I do that? I mean, druids looks like a good case of it because it's nature-based magic. And like I was saying earlier, one of the things that's easy enough to say is it possible that the cleric or the priest or the paladin is getting their divinely given blessings of magic to heal and to ward off the undead and those types of things? Is it possible they're getting that ability from the divine who is granting it by tapping into the same magic that a wizard might have tapped into? And so that question of like, I tend to feel that's narratively how I want to structure my worlds. So you only have one real overall magic, and it's the channels it passes through that affect how it looks when it gets to the person using it. So you might have a wizard who's tapping into the magic directly, a druid who's tapping into the magic that's being tapped by living animals and trees around them, and a cleric tapping into the same magic through being gifted it through a divine being. So, I mean, I tend to feel that's the better approach, at least going forward. And that tends to inform how I'm looking at what capabilities become available. Because one of the things I've oftentimes thought is, like, is there any reason why a wizard can't cast Cure Light Wounds? Well, that's usually traditionally the healer class, which would be a druid or a cleric, maybe a paladin, sometimes a bard, maybe a ranger, but not a wizard, sorcerer, or warlock. And I was like, that doesn't feel quite right to me. If there's a wizard out there who wants to be predominantly a wizard, but on occasion be a healer for the party, it shouldn't be that difficult for that to happen. So there's a part of that going on. And in 5th edition, there is the ability for you to have a wizard who takes Magic Adept level in cleric or druid to tap into those buffing and healing abilities. I just feel like you shouldn't have to do that in order for that to be a possibility. But with examining that structure of the idea of clerics and paladins and monks, or however you want to structure that, getting their abilities derived from powerful beings who themselves tap that energy from the cosmos, it does sort of inform how I'm going to build out that. And in my settings particularly, where the characters and the players and the game starts everybody off as, sort of unbeknownst to them, minor gods. So I'm looking at this idea of, what does a cleric, a religious spellcaster, tap into if they don't even know they're a god? And if they are the gods, if you go to a city full of minor gods, say you go to the top of Mount Olympus and you're Heracles, and you're just on the mountain, and yes, in mythology he knew he ascended to godhood, but for the sake of being, they don't know they're divine beings. They're just living on the top of their city mountain, their city state. And they have the ruler over them, who is King Zeus. But who are the gods of the gods? Who do they pray to? Well, they don't. They don't have that. And so it was really kind of puzzling through that I really stopped and thought, there are game settings that don't have religious figures over them. And so one of the settings I fell in love with years ago when I was a teenager, I believe, was Dark Sun setting. So Dark Sun was a setting for 2nd edition D&D, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. And the system there had some very unique and interesting differences. There were no gods of Athos, which is the world it takes place on. The Athos, the wasteland, the desert, the burnt world. It's sort of a post-apocalyptic setting where the world is dying. And it's dying because too many people tapped into magic and destroyed it. And there are no gods. And in this world, the very different classes, you have your fighters and you have your thieves, but magic users are shunned because they destroyed the world. So the people who use magic tap into the life energy of plants around them. If there's somebody who's using magic, there's a good chance they're what's called a defiler. And a defiler will drain the life out of the plants and things around them when they cast a spell. And so they leave a dead circle around themselves. Fewer of the other type exists, which is called a preserver. And they have learned to temper their use of magic by still tapping into the life force of the plants around them, but not as destructively. They tap gently and from multiple sources so that they never fully damage or kill the things they draw from. So that's one possibility of doing with magic. Mechanically, it didn't really change anything about how it's used in gameplay. It's still very Vancian, and so thus far, not something I'm doing a lot with. But then we move into the realm of the divine magic, which is a little bit more what we're talking about for this episode. And the thing they had in place of that were a couple of things, actually. There are psionics, which I will not go into a lot of with here, but psionics is essentially just the extension of the idea of training one's mind to, it's mind over matter. It's Uri Geller, I guess his name is. It's spoon bending. It's a self-healing. It's self-hypnosis to stop pain. It's those kinds of things extended to a more fantastic realm. And it's used more in science fiction than it's used in fantasy. But they also have druidic magic or elemental magic. So beings that pray to the elements. And that's as close as they get to priestly magic or clerical magic in Dark Sun, where they're tapping into the elements as a force to draw power from. But there's this other slightly unique to Dark Sun setting category, and it is the Templars. And Templars get their magic bestowed on them by the Sorcerer Kings, the Kings of Athas, the rulers over the city-states that they all, each one of them is a ruler over a given city-state. And beneath them are their Templars, their soldier monks, their soldier priests of their, they're god kings is what they are essentially. And those Templars are also sort of like the other half of a broken clerical class. And the more I looked at it, the more I thought about it, the more that made sense for my game story setting. So to have a setting without an overarching pantheon of gods, but you can still have the city-states that the characters live in and move between, having sort of god kings, god emperors. And those god emperors will have a priestly caste beneath them. And that makes a lot of sense. Now, this brings up a little bit of something interesting about D&D 5th edition. I don't know if it was in previous editions because I never really got the chance to play much with 3rd and 4th edition. But in 5th edition, there is another spellcasting class called the Warlock. And the Warlock in D&D is somebody who has granted spellcasting ability like a wizard, but they've done it through a pact with another entity. Now that might be making arrangements with a angelic being. It might be making arrangements with King Oberon of the fairies. There is the possibility of making a pact with Cthulhu. So you can have these different things that you make a pact with. And I think my pet peeve with that class in D&D is that it almost really doesn't matter. Like, it's just flavor text. In most examples of gameplay, nobody ever has to know who they made arrangements with to grant them power. Like, the player themselves and the DM don't have to know. Oh, I'm just a warlock. I get my gifts from a given entity. Okay. And so then you use the spell slots just like a regular magic user of any other source. You memorize 3 spells, you cast those spells, and they're gone from your head, and you have to wait till the next day to relearn them. I'm like, what? It's just flavor text at that point. What are we benefiting from that? But here's the thing. That flavor text, as a writer of stories, I can see potential for it. And the thing it keeps pointing back to for me is first of all, the term warlock, I believe, comes from Saxon English. It means to be an oath breaker, meant to suggest that anybody who's a warlock broke the covenant with God. And it comes from the witch hunters' trials, where the idea that anybody would be using magic is a break with the covenant with God not to do that. And so it has its foundations in monotheistic Christendom, delineating what one's allowed to and not allowed to be. And so warlock is a pejorative term applied to those seen to be out of step with the agreements with the Christian God. Most people don't know that, so we're kind of splitting hairs on how detailed we want to get with that. But by the same token, it's still taking an approach to looking at magic from a divine perspective. And so I want to look at this kind of a little bit more. You're looking at a cleric caste who basically gets their magic from a connection to a divine being who they pray to and spread the good word of. It's doing the Lord's work is sort of what you're looking at in that kind of situation. So they're doing kind of the same thing that a warlock is. They've made a pact with a powerful being who grants them powers. And a warlock is doing the same thing that a cleric is doing. A higher being is their patron and grants them gifts of power to affect the world in the interests of that higher being. And so I view them as almost sort of like cousin classes. They are very similar. The biggest difference is which of those classes do we get to call, which of those classes of higher entities do we call gods, and which do we just call higher entities? And that ends up informing my sense that in this case, they're really the same thing. A warlock and a cleric are, in essence, using the same pathways to get their magic. Now, in the D&D world, specifically, and oftentimes in games, because a lot of computer games are designed and inspired by D&D mechanics. In most of those systems, that's still just a casing around the same mechanic. Every day, you have a set number of things that you can rememorize, and once you've cast them, you cannot use them again until you relearn them while sleeping that night. And that's just the same mechanic. It's literally the same mechanic as a wizard or a sorcerer or a warlock or a cleric or even a druid. And I think that's sort of broken. I do not think that is the way forward for my setting design. Not for my stories, not for my tabletop game, not for any computer game that I make besides that. So how do I want to make that different? I mean, we've already discussed the idea that when I'm tapping into, if I'm a cleric for Hades, if I'm tapping into the power sent to me by Hades, Hades himself is tapping into the divine, the magic of the universe. He's the pipe that leads the water from the reservoir to me. Whereas a magic user is tapping into the reservoir, I'm tapping into the pipe. That's the biggest difference there. So if I'm using that mentality for structuring magic in a setting of stories, games, or whatever, how can I make that different from a wizard if it's the same thing? Well, for me, the question on both the part of the warlock and the cleric has to be, why are they getting that? Like, you don't make a pact with King Oberon of the Fairies or Zeus of Mount Olympus and have them grant you magic. Just, okay, cool, here you go. Keep just renewing this every day. I'm not gonna pay attention or watch this. It's not an interest. I don't care. Go for it. That's not how that works. It's not how it works in history when monks seek miracles from their deity. It's not in narrative style. It just doesn't make sense. You don't have a character who declares himself a cleric of Hades, but then it never comes up once he's used that to declare that he's just going to get magic to use. It's not how that ever works. And doubly so, that should never be part of the bargain that a warlock engages in. That connection to a higher being is the ticket price for having access to that. And that ticket price is something that requires you to actively work on every day. And so I feel like, and it may be hard to work mechanically in a game system, but I feel like a cleric, at least, probably a warlock, and potentially a druid, but that's a little more tricky, all need to make action each day to earn the favor of those beings who are granting them power. So in the case of a cleric, maybe a cleric of Hades, like we were talking about, do you make a sacrifice each day? In the case of a cleric to Apollo, who has an aspect of healing, do you heal in the name of Apollo on a regular basis? Do you try to convert other people to the faith or dedicate a shrine to the divinity? Or, those kinds of things are important. They're not just a piece of text that you have to read when building a character so that you get access to certain types of magic, and then never again do you acknowledge the import of those things. So I feel like for ones that gain access to magic through a higher being, that some sort of devotional practice to those higher beings is important in gameplay. And in narrative style, that's important. And telling stories and structures like that, that's important. In video games, I do think there's a way to make that happen. And that's sort of informing how I'm thinking about expanding it into tabletop games. It's a currency system. It's an economic system. How many points do you get for performing certain actions on a given day that benefit or spread the word of your Lord? And those points that you earn are what you're using to fuel your ability to perform miracles in the name of your Lord. That makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that's the structure I want to work on for clerical and warlock magic. Honestly, like warlock magic, it makes even more sense when you think about it. I mean, you made a pact with King Oberon of the Fairies. On any given day, is he going to give you just willy-nilly, whenever you want to use it, the ability to cast glamour on yourself to make yourself look like somebody else. It's going to give you the ability to help plants grow. Why would he? Why would he portion out some of the power he's tapping from the greater universe to you if he's only met you the one time and you've never acknowledged him since? The mechanics in the game tend to say, like, that formation of that pact is one that you have to do something in favor of your god, or well, in the case of Warlock, it's you have to do something on a daily basis. Not necessarily a daily basis, but you have to be trying to do something that your patron wants you to do. Well, yeah, that makes sense. You've become an agent of that being in the world. And that makes as much sense for a cleric serving a divine being as a warlock serving a not quite divine being. So I think that's legitimately the best way to make the approach on this. And so I'm kind of working on this sort of devotional currency as the mechanism I want to do that with. Now, that kind of covers one of the magic user classes, which is the Warlock, and one of the healing priestly classes, the Cleric. I'm not sure. I mean, it sort of touches on the Druid, but I'm not sure yet if I'm going to have that be a separate thing. Honestly, I'm not sure. I haven't spent a lot of time playing around with the Druid class yet. It doesn't figure deeply in most of my setting design. The setting design I'm working on starts you off in a world where you have these sort of floating city states above a chaotic landscape. And the chaos landscape is sort of hellish and wild and unpredictable. And the city states are these sort of orderly realms ruled over by god emperors. And in that framework, you can have god emperors, sorcerers, priestly caste of Templars underneath of the god emperors, and you can have warlocks. You can have magic users like sorcerers and wizards. I don't know where druids would come into play, except for maybe down in the realms of chaos, beings who have learned to tap the chaos itself. It's hard to know for sure, and I'll think about it a little bit further. But I do want to potentially go into the next two categories, maybe individually, because I feel like sorcerer has to be separate from wizard. They, of the two, or technically three, wizarding classes, are distinctly different from one another. They should be distinctly different from one another. And so I need to explore that a little bit further, and then maybe dabble a little bit with, like, once I figure out some of that mechanic for those two, which I've got some ideas for, it'll inform those sort of half magic user classes, like the Bard and the Paladin. Paladin is just going to be very similar to the Templars. But like the Eldritch Knights, the Arcane Tricksters as well, they particularly just take a portion of an Arcane Trickster is essentially just a thief with wizarding skills. And with that in mind, those are not as big a priority to figure out. Now, the things like a bard or a ranger, those kinds of things, and a monk, they all have their sort of, they're not a wizard, they're not a sorcerer, they're not a warlock, they're not a priest. Some of the magic they tap into uses the same mechanics of wizards or priests, but it's not quite the same thing. And it may change the overall structure of what we do with the rest of it. So I do have time to think about where they fit in with the rest of it. But overall, I think I'm going to be, I want to focus on the sorcerer first, but I think the direction I'm going with that requires that we also understand what I'm sort of trying to do with the wizard. I might cover the wizard next. And I'm not sure I'll get the chance to do that tomorrow, but I will give it a shot. I'm going to try to be on here regularly. I can't guarantee. But with that said, we are 45 minutes in. That's a good place to cut it. I'm probably going to reshoot these as a more condensed, orderly thought process at a future point. But for right now, it's me rambling. So I will catch you for more rambling tomorrow, maybe. And if not, then as soon as I can. All right, take care and have a good night.